Thank you. My name is Jael de Jong Weissman and I work at Windesheim Teachers College. And we are living through the faded history of a system in education that is no longer serving the needs of the future. The changes in society are rapidly following each other, and we are not keeping up in education. So the educational system is looking for what we call innovation in education. And innovation is a big overused word. So when we speak about innovation, let's be very clear that what we mean is doing what's best for students. It's about doing what's best for students. So when we take that in mind, what does that mean? So to give you an example of how I became an innovator and what it means for education, I'd like to take you back to a story I usually don't share. It's a story from when I was 5 years old and I was in primary school, or in kindergarten as we call it. I was 5 years old and I was sitting in a sandbox with one of my classmates, and I guess we're talking about sand and water and, you know, the meaning of life like 5-year-olds do. And what I should add to the story is I come from an immigrant background, so I was raised in 2 cultures and with a different religion. And I was completely unaware of this. I thought all the kids in my class were like me, because I was not yet introduced to difference on a formal level. So as my classmate talked about Jesus, which was a normal topic in kindergarten, in a Christian kindergarten, it dawned on me that she has a completely different image of the world than I did. So I asked her, you know that Jesus is not really the Son of God, right? Because God can't have kids. It's like Santa Claus, you know? It's just a story, but it's not real. And honestly, I had no idea of the trouble I had caused at all. And I would soon find out, because my parents were called to come to school, and my mom came, and they explained to her that she was to take me home, not to return, and to find me a different school, because I did not fit in their system. This was my first experience in the Dutch educational system. It was not my first school, however, to be kicked out of, because a similar thing happened a year later. And in defense of the teachers, this was a time in Holland where teachers had not yet been trained to deal with diversity and people from different cultural backgrounds and different religions. So before we start to judge my former teachers, let's keep that in mind also. At the end of primary school, however, I experienced a similar occasion where I was advised to go to the lowest level of high school, when my testing indicated I should go to the highest level. So my parents asked the teacher, so could you please explain the advice? And he said, yeah, well, you know, of course in your culture, you don't need to go to school. You don't really need an education. I'd been there for 6 years. And after 6 years, they concluded that being from my culture, I didn't need an education anyway. So, of course, luckily, I started at the highest level of high school because my parents didn't take that advice at face value, but I did flunk right at the first year because I came to high school with that message in the back of my head that I did not belong. So I flunked the first year. I flunked again the 3rd year. And the final years in high school, I think my best subject was skipping class. Really, like I was at the top. And I was called in regularly and talked to. And I negotiated, like I was really tough about it too, like I'm not going to gym class and I'm not doing this and I'm not doing that. And why was I excluding myself from the system? Later I would understand that's because what I was taught from day one. You don't belong in this system. So at some point you start to exclude yourself. You start to find your own solutions to dealing with a system that gives you the message you don't belong. And then I wanted to continue my studies, so I went to the principal of the school to ask for the afternoon off to go to an interview to be admitted into higher education. And he laughed so hard, I can still hear it. And he said, so now you want to study? And he failed to understand that it wasn't that I didn't want to study, I didn't want to go to school, which is a very big difference. If he had taken the time to get to know me, he would have found out what I did during my hours skipping class. I went to the Rijksmuseum at least once a month. Spent 90% of my classes that I didn't go to in the library. Yes, I wanted to learn. I just did not feel I belonged in the system, which would have been the message from day one. So if we look at education and what we can do there, is what really happened. What they did in my kindergarten situations, they were confronted with a situation they had not been trained to handle. They had been trained content knowledge, they had been trained in pedagogy, they had, however, not been trained in dealing with change. And when you come into a situation where kids from different cultures start to come into a country, this is a changing situation. And no one had been trained to deal with change. And so they did what we do when we're scared of something, they excluded me. And this continued throughout my education. And it brought me the biggest gift ever, which I learned to function and blossom outside of the system, which serves me well as an educational innovator. Because from there, we look at, okay, so what is our system, what do we need, and what needs to be done? So, thank you to all my teachers for excluding me all the time and not understanding. You brought me a very important lesson. You taught me, what I want to do in education and why I do it. So in Teachers College, we train teachers. We train them for primary school or high school, or both. But we don't really train teachers, we train what we call teacher artists. And this is what my teachers could have used. The difference between a teacher and a teacher artist is a teacher artist has the content knowledge, the pedagogical skills, but is also trained to make what Gert Biesta calls educational wise decisions, which we frame in the framework of virtuosity as a teacher. Like we know from violinists, they can be virtuose players, But as teachers, what does that mean? It means you make educational wise decisions. And when you are confronted with a situation you've never dealt with, from a kid from a different culture who says something like, am I going to deal with the parents of the other child? You have been trained to discuss with each other, to have dialogue, to get everyone around the table, to talk to this kid. And they should know, of course, kids have magical thinking, so you can never touch Sinterklaas. But, that's what they did. They freaked out because they had not been trained to think as change leaders. Now, in Teachers College, we try to do this, because I'm not that unique. We have a lot of examples of kids who, for whatever reason, feel that they don't belong in the moment. Because your parents got divorced, because you're from a certain neighborhood, because you have difficulty reading. There's always reasons why you feel excluded or not belonging within the system. So when you have teachers who are trained to make educationally wise decisions and take leadership, the game changes. This requires, however, that you're interested in what drives students. What do they want to learn? How do they want to learn? And these two questions, what do you want to learn and how do you want to learn, are basic questions in Teachers College. We ask them from day one, what do you want to learn? It's very difficult in the beginning because students tell us, just tell me what to do. Because that was, that's what you're used to. They tell you in school what to do. So it's a very uncomfortable question. But slowly you start to explore, and then you say, how do you want to learn? And at this point, I'd like to introduce you to my former student, Daniel Kolpa, and he will tell you something about how he, with his students, uses the way we train our students in his education.
Yeah, I did this by not designing all my learning activities before entering the classroom. And this might sound crazy, but we all know the classroom practices where a teacher comes up with the learning goal, the learning activity, and sometimes even the learning outcomes. Am I right? But when you flip this around and you really challenge your students to create their own learning activity, you create an environment where your students are actually in the center of their own learning. Allow me to give you an example. I gave a lesson about the Archimedes principle, and you will be aware that some objects float whilst others sink, right? The general concept that governs floating and sinking is called the Archimedes principle. And after discussing this subject with my students and looking at the 5 different levels of learning goals, my students got to work. And some of them, they went to the local park to do an experiment, whilst others were staying in the classroom and making a PowerPoint, or coming up with a quiz, or even drawing a schematic diagram. All of them connecting the learning goal of the lessons to their own activity. And I've been teaching this way for almost a year now. And I think it's a really good way to really engage your students in their own learning. And I think that getting students directly involved in their own learning by personalizing it and making it applicable to real life situations is crucial if you want to empower each individual learner.
Now, the empowerment is a very big issue, because if we look at difference from a cultural or religious perspective, we're not really painting the whole picture. Because if we look at this room, for example, there is difference everywhere. There is no actual proof for the norm. We say stuff like, you don't fit within the norm, but there is no actual proof anywhere in nature that there even is a norm. So an important point here is, if you want to individualize and personalize learning, is that you get to know your students. And our most memorable learning moments are those that involved deep relationships with teachers and fellow students. We think back at the most crucial learning experiences. There will be memories of classmates we did projects with, teachers we had crucial conversations with. So at the heart of personalized education is relationship. And relationship requires knowing who you're dealing with and valuing their difference, and also understanding that sometimes kids don't see their difference as a value. Sometimes kids feel their difference is a disadvantage, a reason to not belong. And as teachers, the step to take then is to see what do you want to learn, how do you want to learn, and where is your voice? And to explain to students, you have a voice, and there's multiple ways of voicing it. And it can be by doing a TED Talk, but it can also be by in-group work, adding your own individual point to it. For learners to develop the capacity to function within the 21st century, we work with what we call 21st century skills: collaboration, communication, critical thinking, creativity. In order to develop these skills, it's important to not just sit in a static classroom situation, but allow students to do their own projects. In Teachers College, this means that while I would like to have full control over my students, I have none. My job is to sit next to them, to ask them what you want to learn, how do you want to learn it, and to help them along in the process, even though sometimes I'm so scared of the outcome. Will they do as well as our old regular system? Because of course we have this worry ourselves as well. If you give a student full freedom, is he going to reach the point we need him to reach? Our experience so far is they reach far beyond this point, but doesn't mean we don't lie awake sometimes at night. When we experiment in education, it's always a scary thing. Daniel, how did you experience the freedom you've been given in your research projects and your education for your own development?
I already spoke about my role as a teacher. Well, I think it's so very important for my students to create their own learning goals and having an environment where they can create their own activities. And I think it is as much important for myself as a learner. And during my time at high school, I learned for a test one day in advance, did the test, and forgot most of what I've learned. And I think this is a scenario we all know probably too well. But at Teachers College, this all changed at day one, when they asked me, what do you want to learn and how are you going to do this? And there's something really important regarding these two questions. It's about the word you and connecting these to the words what and how. It's about really involving teacher in training in their own learning. And during my 4 years at Teachers College, these two questions were the core of my own learning. And because of this, my aspirations were always the starting point of my own learning. And as I already mentioned before, I now teach much in the same way. And I think it's very important, if we expect teachers or teachers in training to teach in these environments and create environments like this, they should be educated the same way.
There's a crucial goal to obtain here, which is to create a playing field that allows all students to play along, regardless from which families or backgrounds we come from. This is not equality, because equality means that, you just come, you have the same rules, etc. But when you come from a different background, you might need a little bit more. So the chance here in education is, by this way of learning, you enable everybody from every background to do well. It's our responsibility and our moral obligation to create learning environments for students to perform in a way that allows them to create their future while in the present, regardless of where they come from.